In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Ganzfeld Experiment. The Ganzfeld Experiment is a parapsychological experiment used for testing the existence of telepathy. Telepathy, in case you don't know, is the ability to receive information from someone distance without the use of ordinary senses or any other conventional means. It addresses the question of, is telepathy real? Is it really possible to answer this question, we must first understand its procedure, criticism, and literature behind it. The term Ganzfeld is a German word meaning whole field. It's a mild form of sensory stimulation originally introduced to experiential psychology by the German psychologist Wolfgang Metzger to study the perception of visual imagery. It is simply a procedure where an exposed individual sees vivid mental hallucinations similar to those of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, mushrooms, and DMT. The hallucinations occur after the individual's brain has been stimulated. However, the Ganzfeld was more commonly used in parapsychology than conventional psychology. In order to understand this procedure, you must first understand its three phases. The Ganzfeld consists of three phases. The first one is sensory deprivation. The second is reception. And the last one is judgment. Let's say Jack, the left, is the sender, Jill, the middle, the receiver, and Eric, the right, the experimenter. Phase 1. Sensory deprivation. Let's say that Jill is the participant receiver in the experiment. During the sensory deprivation procedure, Jill is escorted to an electromagnetic soundproof chamber. Before Jill is sealed and locked into an electromagnetic shielded soundproof chamber, the experimenter or Earl asks her to speak aloud any impressions that come to mind when she is in a Ganzfeld state. Meditations will automatically be recorded. Afterwards, Jill enters the chamber and relaxes in a comfortable reclining chair. Errol, the experimenter, then places half ping-pong balls over her eyes, puts the headphones on her ears, and turns on the red light. After a few seconds, the headphones will start playing white or pink noise, and the red light will be the only thing she will see. In a few moments, Jill wouldn't be able to tell if her eyes are open or closed, and she won't be able to hear nothing but white or pink noise. These, combined with the red light, will eventually put her under sensory deprivation and stimulate her brain to provide vivid hallucinations. Afterwards, Earl shuts the door to Jill's chamber, and the computer automatically locks the door to prevent anyone from getting in or at least interfering with her. Phase 2. Sending. After the sensory deprivation procedure, Jack is also escorted by the experimenter Earl in his own chamber. Once Jack is in the room, he sits down in a chair with a video monitor in front of him. The experimenter then leaves the room, closes the door, and the computer automatically locks it. At this point, the interactions between Earl, Jack, and Jill are completely automated to ensure the experimental procedures are followed exactly the same way in each session. So a computer randomly selects a target, an image, or 1-minute video clip from a pool of over 200 images and videos. The purpose of the pool is reasonable so that each of the 4 images or videos within the pool are completely irrelevant to each other as possible. Once the computer randomly selected a target, the computer automatically shows it to the sender, Jack. Jack now tries to mentally send the target to Jill. Also, Jack can listen, not chat, to Jill over a one-way audio link as she describes her ongoing imagery. In this way, Jack can use Jill's impressions to help adjust his mental sending strategy, like a kind of biofeedback. During the 30-minute sending process, depending on the experimental procedures, Jack might mentally send the target a total of 10 times, interpreted with short resting periods. Phase 3. Judgment. After 15 to 30 minutes, depending on experimental procedures, Errol informs both Jill and Jack that the sending phase is over. Jill then removes her ping-pong balls and turns off the red Ganzfeld lamp. Errol turns off the white noise playing over Jill's headphones. Then a computer automatically presents the 4 images or videos in random order to a video monitor in Jill's room. Afterwards, the experimenter tells Jill to rank the 4 images or videos, one which is the accurate, 1 to 4 based on her impressions during the Ganzfeld state. Earl, as well as the receiver, does not know the actual target, so the possibility of the experimenter telling Jill the actual target or biasing has been ruled out. Now back to the judging process. One of the 4 images you see above is the actual target, while the others are decoys. So Jill ranks the 4 images of videos 1 through 4 based on her impressions. If she ranked the actual target 1 as a direct hit, otherwise as a direct miss. The probability of the receiver getting a hit is 1/4 or simply 25% chance. If she is able to get hits, then what will be expected by chance alone, then that is considered evidence for telepathy. Once she ranks the images 1 or the session is over, the center shows the actual target and the session either gets a hit if right or miss if wrong. And that's the Ganzfeld station. The beginning. It started in the year 1974. Charles Huntington had a great interest studying whether or not telepathy can occur in altered states of consciousness such as the Ganzfeld state. He used ordinary people who don't claim to be psychic in his laboratory to see whether or not information can be transferred from one's mind to another. Between 1974 and 1982, 42 Ganzfeld experiments were performed at the Princeton Research Lab, New Jersey. During the year 1982, Charles Huntington, the left, presented a paper at the annual convention of the Parapsychological Association that summarized the results of the Ganzfeld experiments and concluded that they represented sufficient scientific evidence for establishing psychic phenomena, typically telepathy. Ray Hyman, a skeptical psychologist who still doesn't believe in psychic phenomena, disagreed. Ray Hyman is the guy on the right next to Charles Huntington. Charles Huntington, along with Ray Hyman, did an independent meta-analysis for the same studies and presented their meta-analysis in 1985. Huntington thought that the data at the time indicated the existence of psi, while Hyman did not. Hyman's earlier criticism was that the Ganzfeld papers did not describe optimal protocols, nor were they always accompanied by appropriate statistical analysis. He presented in his paper a factor analysis that he said demonstrated a link between success and 3 flaws, such as randomization errors during the judging phase. Huntington, on the other hand, asked statistician David Saunders to look at Hyman's factor analysis, and Saunders concluded that the number of experiments were too small to complete a factor analysis. The truth is, the earlier Ganzfeld studies examined by Hyman and Huntington themselves actually had methodological problems that were well documented. Huntington reported only 36% of the studies, that's 15 out of 42 Ganzfeld studies, that used duplicate sets to pictures to avoid handing cues. But according to Ray Hyman, there were flaws in all of the 42 Ganzfeld experiments. 6 of those concerned statistical defects. The other 6 covered procedural flaws such as inadequate documentation, randomization, and security flaws. Because of these flaws, Huntington agreed with Hyman that the 42 Ganzfeld studies did not support the existence for psychic phenomena. Therefore, they created what they called the post-joint communique. The post-joint communique. In 1983, Huntington had started a series of experiments called the Auto-Ganzfeld. The Auto-Ganzfeld is actually the same Ganzfeld experiment that I explained with the 3 phases in his PowerPoint presentation. Now back to the subject. Huntington's Auto-Ganzfeld studies were conducted at his Psychophysical Research Laboratories, PRL for aberration. These studies were specifically designed to avoid the same potential problems that Hyman and Huntington found in those 42 earlier Ganzfeld studies. In 1990, Huntington published a meta-analysis consisting a total of 11 Auto-Ganzfeld studies and claims they met the standards considered by the skeptic Ray Hyman himself. The PRL Auto-Ganzfeld studies continued until September 1989. Having only 354 Ganzfeld sessions, only 122 produced direct hits. This 34% hit rate was similar to the 37% hit rate of the 1985 meta-analysis, or MA for short as an abbreviation. These experiments were statistically significant with a corresponding C-score of 3.89, which corresponds to a 1 in 45,000 probability of attaining extreme or more extreme, a hit rate of at least 34% by chance, whereas the average chance expectation is 25%. The meta-analysis actually showed really strong evidence for telepathy, even though the studies were done in the way the non-believer psychic Ray Hyman expected it to work out. Was Ray Hyman finally convinced that telepathy was to work? Well, Ray Hyman himself said, "I agree that the post-joint meta-analysis met the standards that I expected. I also agree that the overwhelming evidence has randomization flaws, procedure flaws, nor statistical flaws. I therefore conclude that something interesting was going on with the Otto Ganzfeld studies. However, despite my agreements, I do not believe it was the work of ESP. It was clear that Ray Hyman was convinced that something interesting was going on in the Otto Ganzfeld post-joint meta-analysis. However, he denied it was the work of telepathy simply because he believed there has to be something wrong with the studies. Yet, after 20 years, he, as well as the skeptics, still couldn't find an explanation for why test subjects were scored so high in a way that would hardly happen by chance alone. Now, what do I think about this? I think the evidence for telepathy is quite obvious, but given my scientific point of view, I don't consider it proof, given that there's a possibility that telepathy might be rewritten based on new evidence. However, I have no doubt that the post-joint meta-analysis actually favors the existence for telepathy. The 1985 MA meta-analysis by Charles Harnett concluded that there was indeed scientific evidence for telepathy. However, Hyman disagreed. He disagreed and yet agrees that something interesting was going on. It was clear that Hyman was denying the evidence that telepathy was involved. Now, 10 psychologists and statisticians actually gave a comment regarding the 1985 MA, and none of them actually agree with Ray Hyman. Another meta-analysis that replicated the results found in the post-joint communique is the Hornerton and Development meta-analysis. In 1994, Hornerton and psychologist Development published a Ganzfeld meta-study in the Psychological Bulletin. In case you don't know, a meta-study is a cross-section of independent studies within the same research. The study included 100 men and 140 women in 354 Ganzfeld sessions. The age of these men and women ranged between the age of 17 through 74. The meta-study included 3 pilot and 8 formal studies. 5 of the formal studies used first-time participants who serve as the receiver in each session. The remaining 3 studies used experienced participants. If you look at the meta-analysis over here, you can see that there were a total of 11 Ganzfeld studies. The sample size of the 11 studies is actually 329, and the total hits out of 329 trials is 106, and that's a 32% hit rate. Now, according to the Two-Tailed-Fisher's exact statistical analysis, the p-value for this meta-study is actually 0.003, and the C-score is 2.96, while the effect size is 0.16, which is a really small effect size. Now, the probability of a false positive, which is a study that shows evidence, but it is in fact caused by coincidence, is actually 1 in 200. So the chances of this being due to coincidence is actually pretty small. Now, the evidence for telepathy is actually quite moderate. However, it is not strong as the post-joint 85 meta-analysis. Despite that, only 2 studies show statistical significance. Possible mundane explanations. In recent years, behavior scientists have become increasingly aware of the selective reporting problem, the likelihood that successful studies are more likely to be published than unsuccessful ones, which are more likely to be consigned to the file drawers of their disappointed investigators. Parapsychologists were among the first to become sensitive to the problem, and in 1975, the Parapsychological Association Council adopted a policy opposing the selective reporting problem of positive outcomes. As a consequence, negative findings have been routinely reported at the association's meetings and its affiliated publications for almost 2 decades. As has already been shown, more than half of the Ganzfeld studies included in the meta-analysis yielded outcomes whose significance falls short of the conventional 0.05 level. Because it is impossible by definition to know how many unknown studies, exploratory or otherwise, are languishing in file drawers, the major tool for estimating the seriousness of selective reporting problems has become some variant of Rosenthal's file drawer statistics. An estimate of how many unreported studies with C-scores of 0 will be required to exactly cancel out the significance of the known database. For the 28 direct hit Ganzfeld studies alone, this estimate is 423, a ratio of unreported to reported studies of approximately 15:1. When it is recalled that a single Ganzfeld session takes over an hour to conduct, it is not surprising that despite his concern with the retrospective study problem, concurred with Hornerton and other participants in the published debate that selective reporting cannot possibly account for the overall statistical significance of the Ganzfeld database. Sensory leakage. Because the Ganzfeld is itself a perceptual procedure, it goes a long way toward eliminating potential sensory leakage during the Ganzfeld portion of the session. There are, however, potential channels of sensory leakage after the Ganzfeld period. For example, if the experimenter who interacts with the receiver knows the identity of the target, he or she could bias the receiver's similarity ratings in favor of correct identification. Only one study in the database contained this flaw, a study in which subjects actually performed slightly below chance expectation. Second, if the stimulus set given to the receiver for judging contains the actual physical target handled by the sender during the sending phase, there might be cues, such as fingerprints, smudges, or temperature differences, that could differentiate the target from the decoys. Moreover, the process of transferring the stimulus materials to the receiver's room itself opens up other potential channels of sensory leakage. Although contemporary Ganzfeld studies have eliminated both of these possibilities by using duplicate stimulus sets, some of the earlier studies did not, which was the time when Ray Hyman and Charles Hartington argued before the post-joint communique. The same thing also applies for randomization networks and experimental bias. The evidence so far. So far, we know that a 1985 meta-analysis by Hartington and Hyman have indeed been replicated to show the existence for telepathy. We also know that 10 psychologists and statisticians gave out a comment and actually didn't agree with Hyman. And now we know that the 1994 meta-analysis published by Charles Hartington and Daryl Bem also show evidence for telepathy. Now, the question is, have there been skeptical replications that actually show the evidence for telepathy? The answer is yes. In 1999, Richard Weissman, the one in the top left corner, and Julia Milton, well, there's no picture of her, published their own Ganzfeld meta-studies in the Psychological Bulletin. In their article, The Psychist, Lack of Replication of an Anomalous Process of Information Transfer, Richard Weissman and Milton concluded that there was no scientific evidence for the existence of telepathy. Weissman-Milton meta-study. The Weissman-Milton meta-study consists of a total of 30 independent scans respectively done by different researchers. The meta-study has a total of 1,198 Ganzfeld sessions done with 327 hits in total. According to their meta-analysis, they found non-statistically significant evidence for telepathy. The p-value for this meta-analysis is 0.24 with a Stouffer C calculation of 0.7. Now, given the lack of the p-value being statistically significant at the 0.05 significance level, Weissman and Milton concluded that there was no evidence for telepathy. However, a closer look at the meta-analysis shows this was in fact wrong. Where they gone wrong? When you do a meta-analysis in statistics, it is always important to make sure the meta-analysis gets weighted. A meta-analysis is generally weighted by the inverse variance, which is very similar to sample size of each study. Milton and Weissman, however, did not follow this important tip. Instead, Weissman and Milton incorrectly weight the meta-analysis by the number of studies rather than the inverse variance of each study. They incorrectly weighted the meta-analysis by using the Stouffer C method. The Stouffer C method basically calculates the exact binomial p-value for each Ganzfeld experiment, converts those p-values to the corresponding c-scores, divides those c-scores by the square root of the number of trials in the corresponding experiments to obtain the effect sizes, and then takes a weighted or unweighted average of the three effect sizes. Obtaining an overall significance level of the combined results, one would then use the Stouffer C formula. Now, if you look at Weissman-Milton's Stouffer C calculation, you can see that they calculated the Stouffer C value by adding the c-scores of each study. So 1.94, for example, 1.94 plus 1.33 plus 0.33 all the way to negative 0.24. Now, the additions or the subtractions, they're based on a total of 30 Ganzfeld studies. So basically, Richard Weissman and Milton added all the c-scores of each 30 studies and then divided it by the square root of 30 studies. If you add up all the c-scores, you end up with a value of 3.83, and if you divide it by the square root of 30, you actually end up with a 0.7, which is this one. Furthermore, if you convert the Stouffer C formula into a p-value, The p-value is 0.24. Now this was a mistake in the meta-analysis. Now going back to Richard Weissman and Milton's meta-analysis, you can see that the two-tailed Fisher's exact test statistical analysis is actually the correct method of doing the meta-analysis, because the Fisher exact test method combines the p-values and also adds weight to the meta-analysis by the number of sample size. And of course, when you do a meta-analysis, it is always important to weight the meta-analysis by the sample size rather than the number of studies that Richard Weissman and Milton did. Now, if we look at the statistical analysis, you can see that the results are actually statistically significant at the 0.05 significance level. Now, you can see that the C-score went from 0.7 to 1.80, and it turns out that the effect size is extremely tiny, more than 0.19. Now, the probability of this being a false positive is simply 1 in 20, so the evidence for telepathy cannot be considered that bad nor that good. It's more mediocre, to be precise. But overall, Richard Weissman and Milton did in fact show evidence for telepathy. Now, looking at the evidence so far, we know that the 1985 meta-analysis and the 1994 meta-analysis by Harrington and Darrell Bem have indeed been replicated, showing evidence for telepathy. Now, we also know that in 1999, Weissman and Milton meta-analysis has also shown evidence for telepathy, even though they said that there was no evidence when they in fact used incorrect statistics. Another skeptical meta-analysis that also shows evidence for telepathy is the Andrew Endersby Ganzfeld meta-study. The Andrew Endersby meta-study is actually published on the Skeptics Dictionary, or at least mentioned. Andrew Endersby conducted a total of, well, he didn't really specify his study, so it wasn't really known, but he mentioned that he conducted a total of 6,700 Ganzfeld sessions with a total of 1,922 hits, which is a 28.7 hit rate. Now, looking at the two-tailed Fisher's exact test statistical analysis, the p-value for his meta-analysis was extremely tiny. They're probably more like to the power of -11 or so. And by judging at the C-score, we can tell it was 6.9547, which is 6 standard deviations away from the binomial distribution, which is extremely unlikely. Now, looking at the effect size, however, we can see that it's extremely tiny, given the 0.08 effect size. Now, the probability of this being a false positive is actually 1.11 times 10 to the power of -11. So that is extremely tiny, so clearly it was not due to chance, therefore giving extremely strong evidence for telepathy. Another skeptical replication was done by the JREF memory user Ersby. JREF stands for James Randi Educational Foundation, and he conducted Ganzfeld studies. I do not seem to remember how much studies he conducted, but he conducted, to the best of my knowledge, to the 200,854 Ganzfeld sessions with a total of 782 hits and a 27.4 hit rate. Now, according to his two-tailed Fisher's exact test, he actually found a p-value of 0.003, which is actually quite statistically significant at the 0.005 level. So the odds of this happening is 1 in 304. Now, the C-score for this was 2.9395, and the effect size was again extremely tiny with an effect size of 0.05. Now, the probability of this being a false positive is actually 1 in 200, so the chances of this being due to chance is quite unlikely. So the evidence, even though it shows statistical significance, it shows evidence for telepathy, it is actually quite flawed, because Ersby mentioned to himself that he removed outliers in his meta-analysis, so clearly it cannot be taken seriously, because when you remove an outlier in the meta-analysis, it quickly invalidates the meta-analysis and therefore cannot be considered evidence for anything. D. Radin actually published a 1974 through 2006 Ganzfeld meta-analysis in his book Entangled Minds. The meta-analysis contains a total of 88 Ganzfeld studies, with odds against chance of 29 quintillion to 1, which is 29 million trillion to 1. The studies in these meta-analyses include from Charles Harnington all the way to Nancy Storm and some other researcher. Now, when you combine all these results from meta-analysis, you actually end up with a 32% hit rate. And the odds of this happening by chance extremely tiny, which is more than 1 trillion to 1. So the evidence for telepathy was actually pretty strong in this meta-analysis. Now, D. Redden also provided a funnel plot to show that selective reporting was not an issue in the meta-analysis. Now, this is not the funnel plot that he provided, but he provided a symmetrical funnel plot that showed there was no evidence for selective reporting, and he also demonstrated that the p-value was too high to be statistically significant, to show that there was negative studies not being published in journals as they should be. So, is telepathy real? It seems that Ganzfeld did a great job in not just only showing evidence of telepathy, but replicating from different researchers as well. Now, we're not talking about standard studies. We are talking about studies that were conducted under double-blind, rigorously controlled conditions. In addition, these studies were combined under meta-analyses with careful controls and examination. Whether or not you believe in telepathy, the database suggests that when you conduct these Ganzfeld studies, you will find statistically significant results in favor of telepathy. This is exactly what happened to Ray Hyman, Richard Wiseman, Julian Milton, and Andrew Endersby. They didn't believe in telepathy, and yet statistical analyses say otherwise. So, is telepathy real? Given the independent replication and overwhelming evidence, I have to say yes. Telepathy is in fact real, or at least that's what the evidence say. However, don't think telepathy is like the Hollywood movies like X-Men. There are no studies in parapsychology confirming such powerful telepathy. According to the replicated meta-analyses, telepathy is very weak. It is so weak that it will take over 100 Ganzfeld sessions to confirm its existence. On the other hand, might only require no more than 10 Ganzfeld sessions. It is also important to consider that telepathy and the Ganzfeld were not done by will, but in an altered state of consciousness. Despite the sadness on how weak telepathy is, one thing is for sure. The human mind can, in fact, receive information from someone's mind in a distance through extrasensory perception and altered states of consciousness, such as the Ganzfeld state. Alright guys, so this is the end of the presentation. So if you like my comment, please leave a like. So yeah, thanks for listening.